This show is sponsored by idealworkspace.com, which promotes a healthier way of working through their adjustable standing desk. Check out their latest smart adjustable standing desk at altizen.com, ALTIZEN.com. Welcome to Analyze Asia, the podcast dedicated to dissect the pulse of business, technology, and media in Asia. In this episode, I speak to John Ardman, Editor-in-Chief from TechNote and host of China Tech Talk podcast, where we discuss the myth-busting on China from government, media censorship, innovation, execution, and education system. Hi, John.
Hey, Bernard.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. It's a bit hot here in Beijing, but the summer's almost over.
Probably is a pretty interesting summer in Beijing because there's so many things have been happening because of the recent VPN issue, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on in the news in particular that's been getting a lot of international play, in particular virtual private network technology, but then also, Tencent with Honor of Kings and, a whole bunch of other topics.
And I'm talking to John Ardman, Editor-in-Chief from TechNote and also host of the new podcast, China Tech Talk, which I've recently guest starred in. Of course, thank you for inviting me. And during that conversation, I have already said that I'm going to invite you back to the show.
You did. No, and it was really great to have you on because I think that, for us at TechNode, we cover mostly, technology in China. But then, one of the big stories, one of the big trends right now is as a lot of these companies are moving to Southeast Asia. And so I think you were able to give us a really, really good kind of broad overview of what's happening in Southeast Asia, in particular with Alibaba. And so it'll be great to have you on again where we can dive a little bit deeper into some of the things that we touched upon.
And I'm pretty sure I will be there at your request. So, but before that, it will also be good for me to get to know you better. How do you start your career and subsequently, how do you end up becoming the editor-in-chief from TechNote then?
To be honest, it's a bit of a long story, so I'll keep it short. A lot of it is coincidence and serendipity. When I was in university, I studied Chinese for 3 years. It was my minor. My major was psychology and philosophy, and so in my course of study, I visited China a few times. And then when I graduated, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. It's kind of out the gate. It's hard to find a job with psychology and philosophy that isn't continuing inside of academia, and I knew I didn't want to do that. And so I graduated. I found this random job at a mental health facility for children that was in the area. I quit that job. It was very, very stressful, and I didn't get very much support from my manager. So I quit that about a little bit less than a year into it. Didn't know what I was going to do. So a bunch of my friends, they were moving to Nashville, Tennessee. They were musicians and artists. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to go there and kind of figure it out. But before I moved, I was having Christmas with my father's side of the family. And my uncle at the time, he was actually living here in Beijing. And so I was telling him my plans. I just quit. I was going to move to Nashville. I was like, John, look, you can go and hang out with your friends whenever you want, or you can go to China right now and ride the wave. I just kind of thought about it for a second. I was like, you know what? You're right. That's actually a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? And so I came here. I taught English, as most young expats do. I did that for about a year and a half. Around that time, I also was able to find a part-time job working for China National Radio, doing a daily 30-minute business English show. And so that's kind of cool because we taught our audience, business vocabulary, but then we also discussed kind of interesting pieces of news. And so that really kind of stoked my interest in media in general, but in radio in particular. And so I was able to leverage that into a position at China Radio International. And so I was there for about 5.5 years. And so China Radio International is a state-run media organization. It's the same as like Xinhua or China Daily or the People's Daily. And so it's still, part of the propaganda apparatus, if you will, almost like the VOA of China. So I was there for about 5.5 years. I started off doing reporting and like putting packages together. Towards the end, I actually hosted two different live radio shows, 1 hour each. One in the morning, which was kind of like global headline news and discussion. And then one in the afternoon, which was discussion of like social issues, economic policy, what people were complaining about on Chinese social media and things like that. And that was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about China, and it was really kind of interesting because most of my colleagues were Chinese. And so whereas back then my Chinese reading wasn't so good, they were able to do a lot of research, and I was able to use that research on the show. And of course, in the process, learning, I think, about China what I probably would not have learned otherwise. But then, so after that, so I was there for 5.5 years. I got kind of fed up doing radio, working for China Radio International. I mean, it's not really a place where foreigners are going to, really cultivate their career. It's what I call the bamboo ceiling. I mean, I was there, I was fairly well respected, but at the same time, there was no room for upward movement. And so I started looking around, found a job working for a localization company here in Beijing called Csoft. Very interesting company, but I was there for about 1.5 years. And in that time, I helped them to build a completely new business unit to service Chinese clients, basically helping Chinese clients improve their English language communication. So I was there for about 1.5 years, and then I saw that TechNode was looking for a managing editor, and I was kind of feeling a bit bored. The media, the great thing about working in the media is that there's always something new, there's always something exciting, and you're always learning a lot. I mean, that's one of the things I really love about it. And so I saw that the TechNode was looking for a managing editor. And, technology obviously is a very exciting field these days, and so I applied for it. And to be honest, at the time, I wasn't quite expecting to be considered because I didn't really have much experience working in written content. And at the time it was more on a lark, just kind of see what might happen. Once I started talking with Gang Lu, our CEO and founder, I think that our interests really, really aligned. I was looking for somewhere where I could, build something and also work for an organization that was growth oriented. And that's definitely what TechNode is. And so I've been here since November of 2016, and it's just been up and to the right since then. So it's been really nice.
And it's a pleasure working with you because I syndicate the podcast on TechNode as well. So one interesting thing I probably wanted to ask you, which period were you in China, and also when did you actually move from the US to China?
So actually, I moved to China in March of 2008. It was fortuitously right before the Olympics. Obviously, not because of the Olympics. I've been in Beijing actually since 2008. I met my wife around that time, actually. So I met her about 6 months into actually living here. And we started dating and got married back in 2011. And now we have 2 kids.
So in your career journey, what are the interesting lessons you can share with my audience?
It's a very interesting question. I would say working with Chinese people can be difficult is probably one of the biggest lessons that I've learned. It's not like I'm not being one of those expats who are, just complaining about the indigenous people or something like that. It's not like a colonial kind of perspective. It's more that with the best intentions on both sides, working across cultures is very, very difficult sometimes because both of you might be speaking the same language. Maybe you're speaking Chinese and they're speaking Chinese, or you're both speaking English. And maybe the linguistics are all there. You understand every single word that they're saying. They understand every single word that you're saying. But if you're not careful, and if you don't understand the cues, then it's actually very easy to miscommunicate. And as that miscommunication goes on, expectations become very, very different. As that gap in expectations get wider, then the working relationship is going to be very, very strained. And that's what I'm not sure if that's quite a lesson, but that's the thing that I think that has really characterized my career here in China is just learning how to work with Chinese people is very difficult, can be difficult, but it takes a very open mind and a willingness to listen and to learn how to communicate with them. And again, I mean, it's not to say that it's impossible. Obviously, it's not, but it can be very difficult if you're not coming at it from the right perspective.
So we were talking about a major topic that you and I want to discuss, and we came up with this one called myth busting on China. So yeah. I thought it would be an interesting topic to think about because I think a lot of us who's living outside of China, we have a certain way of looking into China, even for myself, given my forefathers all came from China. So I guess the way to start off is both of us, before this conversation has actually pre-written 5 myths, and we're going to talk about each one as a whole. So I know that the first one you wrote down is China is a communist country and only cares about itself. What is the myth that you want to bust here?
So I first came to China back in 2004 as part of my course of study. I had been studying for a year. As part of my university, we spent 1 month in Suzhou and then another month traveling around China during the summer of 2004. And when I came back, like the first thing that people asked me was, so what's it like? Is it really, what's it like going to a communist country? And, some people even asked me when I came back if I had, come back as like a Maoist or something like that. And to be honest, I had no idea what Maoism was. I was just fascinated by the language and the culture, didn't know much about the history at the time. But that's the thing. I mean, I think that China, obviously the ruling party is the Communist Party of China. Xi Jinping is the chairman and the president of the country. But in a sense, it's not really communist anymore. If you it's very similar to what, if you know anything about the transition that Cuba is going through right now. They're actually modeling a lot of their transition to, centralized control economy to a more market economy based on some of the things that they've learned from China. Whereas in China, I mean, ostensibly, they do follow communist values in terms of, the masses and the people. There is this paternalistic sense that you get from the government where there is this sense that the government needs to take care of the people. But if you look at social mechanisms, if you look at social policies, in some ways China is much more similar to the United States. I mean, you look at the medical care system, and the medical care system, they call it Social Security, and so that covers a wide range of different types of insurances. But Social Security, when it comes to medical care, only covers a very small part of actual medicine, any, like if you want to go to the doctor, you're still going to have to pay, number one, mostly out of pocket. And then you have to go back and actually apply for reimbursement. And then, depending on what types of treatment you get or what types of medicine you receive, you might only get 50 to 80% of the actual reimbursement of that cost to you. And so, there are some parts of the social policy that echo its communist past, but it's definitely, I mean, in practice, China is not a communist country. So it's closer to, as they call it, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And even then, in some ways, the market mechanisms are given much more free play than you see in a lot of Western countries that call themselves capitalist.
Any sign of features that you've seen that actually is a more market-driven economy as compared to a centralized economy? I mean, when I visited China, I think around 2003, 2004 period, it was actually a game changer. I'm seeing so much of development that happened, and within a span of decades, is now actually, they have cities like Shanghai and Beijing, the first tier cities, and of course the new cities that are actually rising up. There's a lot of focus on economic development. But the Chinese government also actually helped its own citizens. For example, it actually gives a lot of input into internet companies, like the conversation I think you and Matthew had recently on the esports, and particularly how they try to use the People Daily actually, making the comment that Tencent, has to limit young kids to play Honor of Kings. Is there something that is actually what you mean by caring more about the people from a Chinese perspective?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And, the People's Daily, they do things like this all the time. And Chinese media does things like that all the time. You don't really hear that many statements from, government officials like that. They usually rely on media outlets to make these types of statements. But if media outlets are saying this, then it does reflect to a certain degree that people inside the government are probably thinking about this or discussing this in a certain way. And the thing is, that's not really communist. I mean, maybe the propaganda mechanism is a bit, similar to what communist regimes in the past have used, and the fact that everything is state controlled, but that's not necessarily communist. And I think that this paternalism that we see from the Chinese government, and then also, expectations from the people, the people, a lot of Chinese citizens expect that the government is going to, treat them like its children. It is there to take care of them. It is there to have their best interests in heart, much like a father does to his children. So I think that has more to do with Chinese culture than it does to do with communism. I mean, you look back at Chinese culture, the emperor historically was believed to be, at the center of the universe, and they were responsible for maintaining the balance of the entire universe. And so that's why they had all these rituals and different festivals and things like that. Like the emperor, he had to go to, the Sun Temple at a certain time. He had to go to the Earth Temple at a certain time, and so on, in order to make sure that balance and order was maintained in the universe. This idea that the Chinese state is paternalistic, again, it's less communist and just more harking back to Chinese traditional culture, I think.
I thought it was interesting that in this myth you talk about Chinese as a communist country and only cares about itself. It's beginning to stretch itself further out of China, as in recently with the One Belt One Road initiative, which basically some in the West call the China New Silk Road Dreams. Can you talk a little bit about the One Belt One Road initiative and actually what does that really signal the shift in where China is going? It's going to be more a global type of superpower where it's beginning to be more opening its doors out into the world?
Yeah, I don't think it's opening its doors. Compared to like Japan and South Korea, I think culturally China is more open. You know, they're much more, the people that I've met and the people that I know in general are much more open to talking with foreigners. They're much more open to learning from Western traditions and kind of Western ways of doing things. That doesn't mean that they're giving up their innate Chineseness, if you will. In fact, some of the most educated in Western quote unquote ways are still very, very nationalist. I don't think that in the sense that the China is opening up to the rest of the world in the sense that they're going to welcome in more of the West. In fact, there's this ongoing debate for years about Western influence in China. And a lot of what some recent statements in the last couple of years from government officials, including Xi Jinping, suggest that the government is actually trying to lessen the impact of other countries culturally and economically on China, inside China. So I think that the One Belt, One Road is just it's a very pragmatic strategy where they're saying, you know, in order to continue to have influence, in order to expand influence, and also to make sure that they have access to the resources and the trade routes, this is one of the initiatives that they need to do, which is to help other developing countries improve in general, mostly their infrastructure. So railroads, energy, telecommunication, and things like that. And it's actually kind of funny because this is one of the strategies that the United States used back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even to today to a certain degree of, you know, talking to developing countries and saying, hey, you know what, we can help you build your roads, we can help build your electricity systems in exchange for, you know, certain concessions, or in exchange for making sure that you only use, you know, U.S. construction companies or U.S. Energy companies or something like that. And so the One Belt, One Road, I think, is almost a mirror image of that U.S. strategy. But whereas the U.S. strategy was much more subtle, you know, going through private organizations, going through the World Bank and the IMF, the OBOR, One Belt, One Road, as it's referred to sometimes, is a bit more overt. It's a bit more like this is very, very obviously sponsored by the Chinese state. And so I think at the end of the day, it's just pragmatic in order to make sure that China has the access that it needs to continue growing and to make sure that it gets the resources and access to trade that it's going to need, that they've decided to build this. And they're doing it in an area that I think they've shown quite a bit of expertise in, which is building infrastructure. I mean, you know, one of the greatest success stories in China is just, you know, their ability to build railways, to build roads, to build sewer systems, and all of these things very, very basic to a growing country.
I'll come to the myth too then. Censorship is everywhere and the Chinese government controls everything. Tell me, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it gets, this is something that I just want to say that, yes, it's real. Censorship is real. The government does try to be very involved in people's life. I would say it's much more involved in people's life than the U.S. government is back in the States. That being said, I think that this issue gets overblown way too often. So I think that we also have to be a little bit careful here as well, because, you know, what do we mean by censorship? Censorship could be the government steps in and says, you know, you can't talk about this, which they do. They do that to media outlets, and they do that to, you know, internet companies and things like that. They definitely do that. But you look at, you know, U.S. media, I would say mainstream media, and they do almost the same thing, but voluntarily. There are certain things that they just will not talk about. And so is that censorship as well? I mean, the government's not telling them not to talk about things, but they choose not to anyway. So I think that we have to be very, very careful when we're talking about censorship, because it cuts both ways. It's not just China that implements these types of policies. So yeah, I mean, like, censorship is definitely an issue, but you see, like, in China, I mean, you know, on a daily basis, people are in some ways more able to do what they want than in the States. I mean, like, In China, the way that I think about it, China is the land of 1,000 regulations. But the thing is, out of these 1,000 regulations, probably like 1% actually gets enforced on a regular basis. What happens most of the time is that these 1% get enforced on a regular basis, and then before an important event. So, for example, the national holiday, which is coming up in October, as well as the 19th Party Congress, which is probably happening in October or November, this large crackdowns happen. Before, there was a lot of DVD stores. And so before these big events, these big important events, police or other enforcement agencies would go in and shut these places down. And then, after the big event was over, then they just opened back up. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, that yes, in some ways the government is stricter, that in some ways there's a regulation for anything that you could almost possibly think of in China. That doesn't mean it always gets enforced. That doesn't mean that the government is always involved in everyone's life and telling them what to do.
So recently, the Chinese government has pressurized Apple to cave in on the VPN apps in the Chinese iTunes App Store. So are they increasing their footprint in terms of trying to allow people from dialing out of China to seek information? I mean, this actually cuts both ways too, right? It also gives strategic tax to the actual Chinese companies who's competing globally by not allowing them to access that information is also just as bad to their own economic status as compared if they had that information. So where do you see the VPN thing goes from here then?
Well, I mean, so with the VPNs, all they're saying with the VPNs is that individuals cannot use unlicensed, unregistered virtual private network technology. Whereas state-run telecommunications firms, they provide virtual VPN technology to businesses, and that's just you can pay for it as a service. So they're not cracking down 100%. All they're saying is that they don't want individuals to be using that. There's a few different things going on. Number one, I think a few years ago, part of the reasoning was to give Chinese technology companies, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, Weibo, things like that, a bit more space to play. And so not having to worry about competing with Facebook, competing with Twitter or YouTube or things like that. So I think that definitely was part of their reasoning. I don't think they're not so concerned about people accessing information. They're more concerned about certain elements communicating and them not having control of the information itself. I think that over the last 2 or 3 decades, the Chinese government, the education system has done a great job educating the country's children to believe certain things about China, to believe certain things about the country and its leaders, to the extent that even if people were exposed to certain types of information, they may not believe it, they may not agree with it, or they might find reasons to invalidate it. And so I think that in a certain sense, the Great Firewall isn't so necessary for that. I think it's more about, you look at the partial block of WhatsApp. Why would they block WhatsApp? Well, the biggest reason is because people use that to communicate. And so they don't want a communication tool that is not somehow under their control. You think about WeChat, for example. All the WeChat servers are based here in China. Every single major Chinese company, technology or no, has a representative of the Communist Party, at their upper management. And so, you look at WeChat, and obviously it's not government controlled, but at any given point, the Chinese government could conceivably say, hey, look, you need to block this, you need to block that, you got to make sure people aren't talking about this, or even, monitor communications on WeChat as well. So that's definitely a big issue for anyone thinking about doing business here, anyone thinking about living here. I mean, like, WeChat is not a secure messaging environment. I'll put it that way.
And I guess they also have no sense of humor because they also banned Winnie the Pooh now, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, you gotta be careful. Don't poke fun of the leaders. They don't like that at all.
I want to get into myth 3, which I thought is the most interesting one. There is no innovation. And you and I, for sure, we know that this is not true. Every time anyone tells me that, Singapore, Hong Kong being fintech hubs, I'm like, I was trying to tell them, nothing what you're talking about. Just go to China, just walk into Guangzhou, turn on your Alipay app, and I'm sure you can walk out without spending a single RMB. So tell me exactly how to bust this myth.
Well, that's the thing. This myth really got going back in the early 2000s when China was becoming more and more of an influence on the world stage, and it was also, becoming more notorious as an exporter of low quality goods. And so I think a lot of it came from that, where a lot of foreign observers, they're looking at what is coming out of China and they say, oh, okay, it's components for phones, it's toys being sold by Mattel and things like that. And so to a certain degree, obviously that's not Chinese innovation at all. But if you come here and if you live here, you can see that there's a lot of innovation going on, but at the time, back then at least, it was mostly for the domestic market. I mean, there are things here in China, go down to Shenzhen, go to Huaqiangbei, and there are things that you can buy here that you're not going to find anywhere else. And that, maybe if you go onto, Alibaba's, they have a market designed for people outside of China. You can buy that stuff there, but, you're not really going to find it anywhere else. And so I think that there's been a long tradition of, these brandless companies, these manufacturers building up, just making stuff that is actually very, very useful for Chinese people that you're not going to find anywhere else. I mean, a great example is accessories for electric bikes. Electric bikes are very, very popular here in China. Motorcycles are very difficult to drive legally. And so because of that, the market ended up going to electric bikes instead. And, go on Taobao and you can find the most random accessories for your electric bike. And all of that is made in China for Chinese people. And to my mind, that is innovation. But I think that, since WeChat and Alipay and things like that, obviously the game has changed quite a bit, where what we're seeing is it's not necessarily innovation for, I mean, it's still innovation for Chinese people, but it's more obvious to foreign observers, I think. And I think that's one of the things that you kind of have to keep in mind as well. Like you look at Tencent and the success of WeChat, a lot of that is based upon their very, very deep understanding of the Chinese consumer. And so just because they're able to innovate, around that product for the Chinese consumer doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be so good at innovating for a non-Chinese consumer. But also I think that, we were talking a little bit about regulations and government involvement. I mean, like you look at bike sharing, for example, you look at actually, mobile payments is a great example. So back in 2014, I believe, the People's Bank of China, the PBOC, made a statement saying that QR codes are not to be allowed to make payments because they're insecure, and they are. There's no guarantee that when you scan a QR code and you agree to make that payment, that it is actually going to who they say they are and things like that. So that's still an issue. But QR codes have blown up since then. And the PBOC basically said nothing after that. And the government was just very, very hands off in many ways, allowing this industry to flourish. Bike sharing even before that, ride hailing is another great example. The number of times that the government said that, this aspect or that aspect of ride sharing is illegal. You're not allowed to do that. But how often companies would actually do it? They would actually, go against the regulation, not necessarily breaking the law, but going against regulations. And they were able to mature the industry and grow their companies by basically, in some ways, defying the government. Ride hailing is another great example where it wasn't until last week that the national government actually implemented national regulations for bike sharing. And this is, a year and a half after, Ofo and Mobike really took off. And so the government in general, as long as it's not too sensitive, the government in general is actually very hands-off with new industries. And so because of that, these industries can really flourish and develop. It's only until they're getting a bit more mature that the government steps in and says, oh, okay, this is how it needs to be done. This is how it needs to be done. And by that time, the winners have pretty much already won.
But the narrative is also changing in Silicon Valley as well. If you listen to Reid Hoffman's Masters of Skill podcast, recently he made this comment that China is probably the only other place in the world that can host a Silicon Valley. He was referring to what is happening in Shenzhen and what is happening in Beijing. And then if you were to think about in Recode recently, it used to be, when American companies talk about China, they talk about them as clones. But when you hear Dave Marcus from Facebook, who runs the Messenger app, say, no, we think WeChat is a great messaging app, and we are actually learning a lot of what they are doing. And in a Recode conference with Kara Swisher around, that is saying something, right? That narrative, it seems to be shifting as well as it's going as well.
A lot of that was, you look at Tencent and WeChat as a messaging platform. I mean, a lot of that was, Pony Ma and Alan Zhang saying, hey, look, we need to build a mobile first a mobile first application. And this was back in 2010 and 2011. This is around the time, like maybe right before I even had my own smartphone. They had launched this application. And so I think that was the real key for them, was they're going to build this mobile first platform. Whereas you have Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I mean, a lot of these, well, maybe not, excuse me. So, you look at Facebook in particular, I think one of the reasons that they've been caught by surprise, you might say by Snap in particular, but then of course, in terms of product development by WeChat, is that they're an older company. They started when the internet was all browser based. And in fact, if you remember, they were very reluctant to create their own native application for iOS and Android. It was only once, their HTML5 applications were really bad, they're like, okay, fine, we actually have to invest in this. And so I think that to a certain degree, Facebook is one of those examples of a company that hasn't really taken mobile all that seriously. Whereas WeChat, Alipay is an interesting example as well, where, Alipay was actually first started on the desktop. It was a way for people to transact and exchange money through Taobao and through Tmall. Once Alibaba realized that they had to move into mobile, they were just like, you know what? If you want to use the desktop application, we're going to make it really hard. And we're going to give discounts and other incentives for people to use the mobile application. And so now, the desktop application is more for vendors and for the back end than it is for even your small seller or your regular buyer. And so I think that's the main innovation for China. Really has just been the recognizing the potential of mobile and really capitalizing on that. I mean, PCs in China were never really a thing. And once mobile came along, it's just up and to the right all the way.
I was actually pretty impressed by the fact that there was recently somebody from Beijing brought a phone that looks almost like the iPhone. It turns out it's actually a Oppo Vivo phone. And of course, not to withstand, a lot of people don't know that there's a blockchain project in China called Quantum, or QTUM. And also the things that Baidu's been working on, the AI, and it's also mounting a pretty big challenge to Google. So I want to get to myth 4, which I think is pretty interesting, is China is better at getting things done. What's the myth about that?
This is something that's bandied about a lot in Silicon Valley, I think, as well as inside the American government. I think one of the best examples of this phenomenon is you look at China's railway system and the high-speed rails, and then, California's attempt to implement high-speed rail at the same time, and always using China as the example. Like, look at China. They just get things done. Why can't we do this? Our democracy is broken, and so on and so on. And so I think it's true to a certain degree that China is better at setting long-term goals and working to achieve them. But the problem is, and this is something that's very, very tied to their education system as well. So in general, I would characterize Chinese culture, in one aspect at least, is that they're very pragmatic. And what I mean by that is that they set a goal. They say, we want to, for example, again, the high-speed railway system. We want to have a nationwide high-speed railway system, and that's their goal. And we want to achieve it in 5 years. Okay, but that's a great goal. And then in terms of them being pragmatic, they don't necessarily care so much about how it gets done, as long as it gets done in time. GDP numbers for government bureaucrats are the same, where a lot of their performance, their promotions, their bonuses, other certain benefits they might get from being a bureaucrat is almost directly tied to the number of development projects that they approved, the increase in overall GDP that their city, county, or province saw in a certain amount of time. And so in those cases, number one, obviously you can massage those numbers. Number two, you can invest in projects that have no long-term value but boost your numbers, but you're boosting the GDP. And so I think that, again, coming back to the railway example, there were some massive problems with the railway system. You don't hear about it very much, but there were some really, really, really bad problems in how some of the railway lines were actually constructed. And in fact, the design top speed of the railway system is actually 350 kilometers per hour. But for the most part, they end up running about 300 kilometers per hour because of some of the ways that some of the shoddy workmanship, the poor quality of the construction of some of these railways. And so, yes, you're right. China does have this amazing railway system, and it is great. But there were some huge, huge problems while they were building it. And so I think that, I think it's a bit of the grass is greener complex, where people look at China and they say, wow, they're doing amazing, but they don't really know enough. They don't really know enough of the details, and so they just kind of put China in some ways on a pedestal.
And of course, if projects like that gets into a national disaster, you can bet the Chinese government is going to hang those people who were involved in the projects. I think many years ago, I think there was this particular where Chinese babies were dying from milk because they found salmonella in those milk, right? They actually executed everybody on the board of directors on that company.
That was no good. And then you look at the railway system, there was a big scandal and big public to-do about the Minister of Railways and a few other people who were in charge of building the railway project. And turns out they were siphoning tons of money out of the funds to build the railways. And then, of course, I'm not sure how familiar you are with construction, but in construction, there's the contractor, and there's the subcontractor, the subcontractor, and all it's turtles all the way down. So that the person actually doing the job, his margins are really, really low. And so he's not necessarily incentivized to use the best materials.
So coming to myth 5, which I think is indirectly linked to your earlier myth, is that China has better STEM education. I mean, it's science, technology, and engineering and math education. Yes. How are the STEM graduates educated in China? I mean, one thing I do know, because I come from Singapore, it's pretty well known that the Singapore educational system has been really good at producing, good A students. But actually, to me, it's mainly rote learning. Just by the easiest way to beat this count is to say, how many Nobel Prize winners are there in Singapore? 0. Right?
Yeah.
So but China is actually producing its own Nobel Prize winner and Hugo Prize winners now. So I probably will have to say that they are actually getting better at it. So what is your basis on that myth then?
Well, I mean, my stepdaughter, she's 11 years old and she goes to a public school here in China. And so I get the opportunity to see the education system firsthand. It really makes no sense. I can give you one example where, so last year, when she's about 10 years old, they're teaching her trigonometry. I didn't learn trigonometry, number one, until I was, I think, in middle school, maybe like late middle school. So this is, 13, 14 years old. So at 10 years old, she's already learning trigonometry, but she's not really learning trigonometry. What they're doing, instead of teaching them the formulas, and so like how do you calculate the area, height times width, and so on and so on, they're doing it in these ways that honestly I don't understand, and it ends up being shortcuts to these calculations. Because I remember there was one time where I was helping her with her homework, and it was how to calculate the area of some shape. And so the first thing that I do is I look it up. I go to Google and what's the formula to calculate the area of whatever. And I start doing it and I show it to her. He's like, no, Dad, that's not how you do it. It's like, what do you mean that's not how you do it? I mean, this is the right answer. And she says, no, but the teacher's not going to accept that. And I was like, oh, come on, it'll be fine. You got the right answer. It'll be fine. And she comes back from school the next day and she's like, no, the teacher said it's not right. You have to do it this other way. On the one hand, they're teaching them these things early. I think beyond, perhaps a bit too early. But on the other hand, they're also teaching them these shortcuts. And so rather than learning the rules, rather than learning what the rules mean, instead they're just learning how to do it as quickly as possible. And then, of course, you look at how much homework she has. And as she's gotten older, the amount of homework has increased. And it's almost all just doing memorization, like doing the same thing over and over again, writing the same word over and over again, doing the same calculations, the same arithmetic, the same multiplication over and over again. And so I think that there's that with the education system. And I think that it's similar to, what I was saying about Chinese people being pragmatic. The goal of education in China is not to learn. The goal of education in China is to get the highest score. The highest score in primary school ensures that you have the opportunity to go to the best middle school. The high score in middle school, gives you an opportunity to go to the best high school. A high score in high school gives you the opportunity to get you into a good university, and a good score in university gets you the opportunity to get a good job. That's the ultimate goal, really, are those numbers. And so, well, how do you get a high score? Well, it's not learning, it's memorizing and making sure that when it comes time to the test, that you can get as many answers as possible in the shortest amount of time. And so that's really kind of what it amounts to. And then, you look, I think that when Barack Obama was still president, he pointed to the PISA scores, these international assessment of reading and mathematics ability. In China, the only schools that were actually tested were some of the top schools in Shanghai. And so number one, Shanghai as a city, as a culture, is not representative of the entire country. The education system, the amount of funding that they get is much better than you're gonna see in Anhui, for example, in some tier 3 or tier 4 city. In some rural areas of China, kids have to walk 2 or 3 kilometers just to get to school. So this idea that somehow China's education system works better is patently false. By basing your, as Barack Obama did, basing your comparison of the U.S. education system and the Chinese education system on this one test, the PISA test, you cannot compare those two, because the scores from China were a very small sample taken from the top students in the country.
I guess what you're actually reflecting is not just only China. I think it's the same with India, it's the same with Singapore and any other parts of Asia where the education system is very emphasized in rote learning and very little independent or critical thinking. But I guess what I would say to that is that essentially it's also dependent on the stages of development. I guess China is essentially, there's a big middle class rising out. At some point, these things will start to self-correct itself. It happened to Singapore at our very early stage, and now we're actually evolving our education towards more critical thinking. I think those things do take time. Probably maybe it's the pace of China that takes that time.
Yeah, I think, in the richer areas, the better funded schools in Beijing, the better funded schools in China, I think you are seeing a slow evolution. But the problem is, some of the brightest kids, some of the most well-connected and well-off people, they end up sending their kids to international schools, international private schools. And so I think that's still a bit of a challenge where you're getting the upper middle class and the upper classes. I mean, they're not even sending their kids to the public schools. They're sending their kids to these very expensive international schools.
This was something that you probably have to watch as the education system evolved. I mean, as a product of that education system, I probably understand where you're coming from. But of course, there's a lot more myths we can talk about, except that time is always limited. But before we get on this, now, instead of asking you one penultimate question, I have two. So the first one I'm going to get to ask you is, do you have any recommendations for my audience? Could be a podcast, could be a book, or could be a movie.
Yeah, so I would say that I was thinking about this before, and I have 3 things that I would recommend, and they're all books. 2 of which I've listened to, and 1 of which I've read. The first one is Homo Deus by Noah Yuval Harari. He is the author of Sapiens, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. But Homo Deus is kind of like the sequel to that book, where he talks about how, like, I think he very succinctly and very accurately explains through a historical lens some of the changes that we're seeing in global culture, and in particular the philosophical collapse of liberalism and the rise of what he calls techno-religions. And so it's really, really interesting. A lot of insight, and actually I think, looking at it through the lens of China, you can actually see already here in China some of what he's saying is already happening. And so I highly recommend that. Also, I just finished listening to a book by Cal Newport. I'm sure some of your audience probably know about it already, but it's called Deep Work. It was really a fascinating I listened to that one as a fascinating listen about how to carve out more time to really focus on what matters, and to make sure that you're cultivating your ability to concentrate. I think that in our current environment with WeChats, with Facebook, with Twitter, all these different inputs and stimulation, it can be very difficult to kind of get lost in it all. And so I think that Deep Work is a great book for some practical applications about how to regain control and really focus on what matters in your career. And the last book that I want to recommend is something that I just started, Kissinger's book on China, and it's called On China, and it's basically a look at China through the lens of their foreign policy. I just started it, and it's very, very clear from the very beginning that Kissinger has a very deep understanding of Chinese culture and the Chinese people. And so if you want to learn more about some of the more recent history of China and kind of why or how it got to where it is now, I would highly recommend that as well.
And I would also put a plug to the recent book that Kissinger has just written called World Order, which actually gives you also a thinking about what China and US as its place in this new world order. So my final question, as always, how do my audience find you?
Well, yeah. So China Tech Talk, obviously, you can find that on iTunes. Just search for China Tech Talk or any other podcast application. Also, technode.com. That's where that's my day job. That's where most of my energy goes into. You probably won't actually see much of me there, but everything that is on that website has my fingerprints on it.
You can find me at bleungcw@bernardleung.com. Subscribe to us at Analyze Asia, ANALYSE. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Acast, TuneIn, and of course Google Play in the US market. Of course, recommend us on Overcast, give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, or even drop me your valuable feedback. And we are actually going to be beginning a new memberships for people to sponsor and to be patrons of this show. So once again, John, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.